Hi, this is Matt from Peak Frameworks, and today we are going to cover what could possibly be my favorite topic that we've covered on this channel so far. So I've always wondered which firms and which schools place the best into private equity, because private equity is a very enviable career to sort of break into, but you always wonder, really what's the best path to get in? And that's what I tried to do here. I manually went through the firm websites, checking all the people that were listed on their websites and which firms they came from, as well as which schools they came from. And in this video, we are going to cover the key observations that I learned while cutting through this data. So let's start with the data collection process, so you understand the assumptions underlying this research. So I only trusted the data that firms would put on their actual websites going through each biography, and I did not trust LinkedIn for this exercise. Another constraint I added is that I was only looking at the New York offices of these firms. And I just did this a little bit to make it easier on myself in terms of collecting data, but also I felt that this was a representative way to view the dataset. I've talked a little bit about how satellite offices recruit differently, and I think they recruit differently enough that they would also change the data. So importantly, this might misrepresent some West Coast heavy firms as well as West Coast specialist schools. So the firms in this set include Carlyle, KKR, Silver Lake, BC Partners, Permira, and I think that overall with these 16 firms, we have enough data to really draw some conclusions. Overall, this is about 300 people, of which 40% were juniors, meaning associates and a few analysts, and the remainder were the mid-level, senior associates, VPs, principals, and some directors. And for this dataset, I was most interested in people below the partner level. And the reason why I did this is because you start to encounter a lot of outliers at the partner level. A lot of partners are 20 to 30 years older. They might have entered the industry during the nascent years of private equity or were some of the first people to join that particular firm. So I feel like it's not as accurate to include them in this data set. So I just had to give that disclaimer because I know that this is not perfect, but I still think that this data is incredibly interesting. Now let's start with what I think is the most interesting data point, which is the undergraduate PE feeder schools. So this is only the college that people went to. So let's start at the top, and it's really no surprise who the best school in the entire world is when it comes to private equity. It's the University of Pennsylvania, or Wharton. And this definitely affirms what I saw when I was in New York, but there are so many people from the school in private equity, at hedge funds, in investment banks, and based on the data, they compose 8% of everyone sort of in private equity. One thing that really contributes to this is that most of the analyst positions across the street go to people at this school. So the University of Pennsylvania has strong relationships. They'll send direct graduates to these private equity firms. For example, Warburg Pincus and Silver Lake almost always hire people from Wharton. The next best school for private equity is Harvard. And I think this really underscores the fact that although in banking recruiting, some other schools tend to dominate because they have sheer volume of people, when it comes to buy-side recruiting, a lot of buy-side firms start to care about traditional prestige. They start to care about traditional cachet. And that's why you also have schools like Dartmouth, Cornell, Yale, Duke that are also really high on this list, but weren't as high on the banking list because a lot of firms just specifically seek out these kind of candidates when they're recruiting. I would say the biggest surprise on this list has to be the Ivy Business School. And that's actually where I went to school. It's a school based in Canada. But this school is like a finance machine that sends the top Canadian students into finance to try to take other people's jobs in private equity. I know firsthand, but Ivy also has strong relationships with specific firms. They almost always send a couple of analysts to Silver Lake as well. And they have very strong ties to Onyx, Onyx being the biggest Canadian private equity firm. What I think is interesting about the bottom of the list is the quantum of people. The number 20 of this school only has 4 people in top New York private equity firms. And that's why it might feel so difficult when you're trying to network, when you're trying to reach out to people, because truthfully, there just aren't enough people in private equity to find and to latch onto. So I would say this private equity list, of course, corresponds to the investment banking list, but it does seem that traditional school prestige seems to matter more. Additionally, I think only Penn and Harvard really have a clear advantage over other schools. After that, I would say there's enough cyclicality in hiring processes that this list is going to change year over year. So I would say pre-MBA spots are relatively diversified. You can come from a number of different schools and still break in. But I would say this next data point is pretty sobering if you're considering getting an MBA. We took a look at all of the mid-level people, as well as whether they got an MBA, and if so, what school did they go to. And overwhelmingly, people either went to Harvard, Stanford, or Wharton. The numbers after these schools is abysmal. 40% of all mid-level people in New York private equity firms went to HBS. After these three top schools, I think it's very difficult to break into these top private equity firms. I think a big reason is because there's only so many spots. So a lot of the people that come as associates into the MBA program will leave as senior associates at the exact same firm. The remainder of the MBA programs are no slouches either. Columbia, MIT, these are all really solid programs as well. So I think unless you're able to get into a top MBA program, it might not be your ticket in. I think it's also insightful to see the no MBA percentage, which is also about 40%. So a lot of people don't even go to business school, they just stay on with the firm that they were recruited with or maybe jump to a different private equity firm. But in total, almost 2/3 of the people in this mid-level of private equity will have an MBA. Finally, let's get to the juicy part. Which bulge bracket places the best? Which elite boutique places the best? And which consulting firm places the best? And it's no surprise, but Goldman actually really does crush it. They have more than 2 times the number of placements versus their direct peers in JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley. At a certain point, I think it's more than just prestige. I think a lot of people I've met from Goldman are quite clearly very bright and very motivated, and I think it's no surprise that they break into the buy side with such ease. After Goldman, it really does start to taper down. All of the firms are kind of within a handful of placements of one another. And I am of the belief that if you're at a top 10 or so investment bank, then you have a relatively equal chance with one another. When it comes to elite boutiques, I would say Blackstone/PJT has overall performed the best. However, the performance has gone down a little bit since Blackstone converted to PJT, but back in its heyday, it was very difficult to compete with Blackstone, including Goldman. Evercore and Moelis have also placed well in recent years, and these firms are smaller than the bulge brackets, so one could argue on a per capita basis, maybe it is a little bit easier to get in from elite boutique. When it comes to the consulting firms, I believe McKinsey places by far the best overall. Both Bain and BCG also place quite well, but I think McKinsey is still a notch above. So in terms of takeaways, I know it sounds kind of like a meme, but I do think Goldman and McKinsey are the best firms when it comes to recruiting for private equity from the banking and consulting side. However, I think if you are at any of the top 10 investment banks, you'll have a relatively good chance and it'll come down to who you are as a candidate. I also think that the placement of these consulting firms is quite telling. A lot of consultants don't even try to go for private equity, and still they place in line with some of the lower bulge brackets. So I think for your overall career, if you're kind of on the fence about where to go, you might have more optionality at a consulting firm. One final thought is here, I only looked at large cap private equity, and I only looked at 16 of the top firms. However, there's lots of firms in the middle market, in the lower middle market, that aren't necessarily going to be as fixated on this list of firms. So if your goal is private equity, you don't have to get fixated on this list specifically. There's lots of people that come from unconventional backgrounds that continue to apply grit and eventually break in. So if you'd like to learn more about recruiting, specifically if you want to learn about the modeling or the case studies, you can check out the course on our website at peakframeworks.com. We cover all the models, headhunter coverage, as well as common questions that you get asked on the interview. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.